just start from the beginning. Tell me, where were you born?
Well, it says Leatherhead on my birth certificate, which I'm quite happy about, even though...
Leatherhead, that's a nice doubling of...
Yeah, no, I was really happy when I got a copy of my birth certificate and it just said Leatherhead on it.
Yeah.
It seemed quite appropriate. I don't really remember it because from like being born...
You mean Leatherhead, not...
Yeah, Leatherhead. From being born until 5, I was just a kid growing up. 2 brothers, 2 sisters, not all born at Leatherhead, 3 of us were. And then when I was 5, my dad got a job in Spain. So in 1965, he moved all of us to Spain, just outside Madrid. And so until I was like 11, 12, we lived in Spain, which I absolutely loved. The rest of the family didn't. It was like the 60s, very kind of Franco time in Spain. My dad was working in, he worked for a precious metals company. So it was all about importing and exporting precious metals. So we lived a pretty flash life. Servants, I used to go to school with all the embassy kids and, you know, we had servants even at one point. So it was like English people living in Spain. But I really liked actually the Spain side of it more than everyone else. I mean, my favourite story about that time is my mum, when she used to go shopping on a Saturday, used to hate dragging me round with her and like the kids around with her. So she just used to drop me at the Prado.
Right.
And then come and pick me up 4 hours later. Well, I was allowed to run round the Prado at 7, 8, 9, and it was my favourite. Once I got into it, you know, I'd rather stare at Goya and Velasquez. I think a lot of kind of my passion for art and visuals did actually come from that time. We were really well educated. The schools were great. I was fluent in Spanish and French at quite an early age. And I hated it when they had to move back because my mother wasn't very well. And then when we moved back to England, they moved back to Devon. And it was that time, you know, where you had, going into education here in this country, they didn't really teach languages then. I mean, the French teacher hated me because I spoke better French than him, so I was forever getting a clip round the ear on that. They didn't even know what Spanish was. You know, so my education went actually down, which was the start of me being a rebel, really, because I was like, what am I doing here? I know more than these teachers, kind of attitude. So I suppose 13, 14, you know, it was the kind of Mark Bolan, David Bowie time. And I'm stuck in the middle of the countryside on a farm with all my glam rock pictures over my bedroom wall going, how am I going to get out of this mess? So I became I used to love drawing, making things. I was very one of those kids that would just go to their bedroom, close the door, play my records over and over and over again, the same records, and make things and draw. And so I didn't really feel a link with the countryside.
I mean, just to talk about that, we'll rejoin it at Mark Bolan in a bit, but just to go back, I'm fascinated at that idea of you in the Prado, and you must know those paintings well, you must know them firsthand, and I mean, just say a little bit more about what intrigued you about those paintings. I mean, you're seeing there Velázquez Las Meninas, you're seeing some of the best paintings possibly ever made. Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't educated. I educated myself about them because I just found I mean, it's so rich, that Spanish art. There's just something about it that just hit me. I mean, you know, some of the Goya, especially like the drawings and stuff, I'm amazed they let me just kind of wander around on my own. And as a young kid, I mean, it's scary. It was like watching horror film, but it was like a drawing or a painting, you know, I don't know. It was all about stories and emotion, and I used to love it. I was like, yeah, bye, Mum. Yeah. You know, once I got into the swing of it, and I'd go back and I'd revisit the same painting, especially Las Meninas and things like that, where you could just, I'd quite happily sit in front of it for hours.
And it's a very majestic period of Spanish history, isn't it? I mean, you making the
Well,
leap.
it's so passionate.
Yes.
And it was all about people. You know, some of the portraiture and things, and you know, as a young kid, it just sets your imagination off.
Yeah.
You know, because it's like, who are these people?
Yeah.
Who is that? You know, it was a bit about, it went from everything, from like people, real life, street people, right through to royalty. Yes. I don't know, it just ignited my imagination. I loved it.
It illustrates the Spanish royal court, and in a sense, it like you say, it creates a social picture. The Prado, I felt, you know, that there's a sense of it being. I mean, Spain is like at the top of its game, as it were, and it's kind of almost like the artists are getting penetration into the royal courts, perhaps in ways that they hadn't before. Possibly socially, but also in the way they were depicted.
And some of the subjects, I mean, Goya on war, there's never been better pictures done of that.
Yeah.
You know, even now, they're quite shocking in a, I don't know, it just covered all the bases for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I really associated with it. In fact, what was I? I was a kind of quite a privileged kid in Spain. Why would I feel a link to these quite wild pictures or very haughty portraits, or
what
I
was
don't
the
know
connection?
what I don't know.
The finery or the scene quality?
Well, my mother always says, even from my Leatherhead days, you know, I was always the one that went, oh, Mother, not those shoes with that dress. And it would be like, Mum, not those shoes with that suit, or I'd always want to paint her nails. And then when the 60s came, and it was all, my mother had really crap eyelashes that were really nothing to them, so she started wearing false eyelashes, but she hated putting it on, but I loved putting it on. So she used to come to me and go, put my eyelashes on. You know, even at like 5, you know what I mean? I just liked the whole process. And I always had an opinion about what she was wearing. And or if I saw one of my cousins wearing like a mad flowery shirt or something, I'd hound her until I got one. You know what I mean? I wasn't very good on school uniform or anything like that. I was more like, that was a chore, school uniform, because I looked the same as everyone else. I wasn't big on that.
Did it impact on you the way people were dressing at that time? I mean,
Well, from a really early age. I mean, she's not alive anymore, but she always used to say that I always had an opinion on it, and I was normally right because I kind of knew her wardrobe. You know, I wasn't a tranny or anything. I wasn't trying it on, but I knew what she had in there, what her favourite bits were, and how she did her hair and stuff like that. So where does that come from? I don't know. Dropped on my head as a baby, maybe, or something.
when you mentioned that moment, I think that you described it so well, being surrounded by posters of rock stars and Mark Bolan and
Oh,
there you
my
are.
whole wall. You used to, well, in those days, you used to cut out any picture. If you liked Bowie or you liked Bolan, or if you saw any picture of them, you'd cut it out. And everyone's bedrooms were like little jigsaws of your favourite pops, you know.
That's something that I don't see quite as much, because I remember, for instance, I once bought a big piece of hardboard onto which a child of your generation at that time had cut out the most amazing pictures of things like the TV Times and bits of newspaper, and it wasn't just a bit here and a bit there. It was the most intricate thing. They'd probably had to work out what the big picture was, where the small pictures, you know, it was complicated.
It was a changing thing, you know.
And it meant a lot to.
And also records.
Yes.
The way people view things has changed a lot. But you used to, if you got a new record, you used to play it over and over and over and over again. Now they'll find the record and they can switch on to another one really quickly. Yeah. Whereas then, if, you know...
You had to know it.
You know, when Ziggy Stardust came out, you played that until the grooves ran out. You know what I mean? It was like... Until you knew every lyric, it was a different way. You looked at the packet, you read every credit on it, who was involved. They don't have the patience for it now, I don't think, or they don't have the dedication. The dedication's changed, maybe.
On the back of the Ziggy album it says play at maximum volume, so you did.
Which I did, and I probably got a clip round the ear for doing it. Do you know what I mean? I remember they stopped my pocket money when I bought the New York Dolls album. You can't be buying that record. Did you see what he bought this Saturday?
But it was a movement, wasn't it? I mean, it was like the news for me. It was more important than anything to receive that type of information at that level about coming from these fabulous individuals like David Bowie.
Well, I'd say at my school where I was, you knew the Bowie fans. There weren't that many. Most people were into Slade, kind of like the Yobbo side of it, whereas we were into like, who is this person? Yeah. Oh, well, if he can be like that, I mean, that is the success of Bowie. I know we're talking after him dying recently, but that is his success. I was a kid stuck in the middle of the countryside going, well, if he can do it, there must be another world out there, because that's not pigs and fields, you know what I mean?
It's an incredibly British phenomenon, that, I think, about being isolated in the bedroom while receiving these incoming messages through records, which take you to another universe that you ultimately want to join.
I suppose now they have the computers, so they can access any kind of information, but then, I'm not saying we were limited, it didn't hold us back, I don't think. But it was our link to possibility.
And you talk about a very physical world. You talk about a world in which you're cutting things out to put on your wall, and you're talking about getting these albums and holding them and reading them and living with them, and the vinyl being worn out and so on. And I've heard from many people say it was about reaching those things was not actually easy. You couldn't. I mean, I don't know where your nearest record shop would have been in Devon.
Luckily, I used to have the school I went to. I lived in a tiny little village on the edge of Dartmoor, and we used to have to get up at 6 o'clock to get an hour's bus ride into Exeter, get off in Exeter, wait for another bus to take us to the school. I mean, it was quite a number to get to school every morning. But then mornings was always boring. You used to try and fall asleep on the bus. But on the way home, once you were released from school, right next door to Exeter bus station used to be a record store called The Left Bank, it was called, and it was very kind of hippie. But there was one of these bloody hippies, when I went in and started buying Bowie, and then because of Bowie, I got into Iggy, and then Bowie kind of got a bit booted out the way because I went mad for Iggy then, and Lou Reed. But it was because of Bowie that you were finding out about that. Yes, And this sweet old hippie in the record shop used to go, you should listen. And they used to have two little booths in the back of the shop where you could get, about the size of a phone booth, but you could go in and listen to a record. Well, I must have worn out about at least 3 copies of Horses by Patti Smith, and it's when I first got into reggae, and this guy in the record shop obviously saw something, but this kid's not buying you normal. So it'd be like, oh, new Velvet Underground or new Lou Reed's come in, so I'd rush off to the booth and he'd put it on. So I was kind of educated by this mad hippie at the record shop. And then I'd save up my pocket money. I forget how much my pocket money, but it was never enough to buy all the records I wanted, but then he used to play them for me in the booth if I really had to hear the record. I remember Horses, I must have worn out. When Patty brought that out, it was like...
Just while we're here, because you said it earlier, and it's absolutely right. Today is Thursday. David Bowie passed away on Monday. It's B-3, as I call it. I mean, it's been a shock, I think, for anyone. But especially for people who grew up with Bowie, and actually it felt like losing a relative, possibly worse actually at times, because I mean he would have been with you all your life.
I mean, it sounds a bit corny, but we were quite a large family and quite a happy family. I didn't have an unhappy childhood, but I really didn't have anything in common with my other brothers and sisters. I mean, Rob ended up going to Sandhurst and being in the army. Then there was me. Then there was Nick. He ended up being a policeman. Then there was Jane. She ended up being a nanny nurse. Then there was Jenny. She ended up working in insurance. So I kind of stuck out a bit much.
I was going to say, you're surrounded by the sort of perfect the pillars of society.
And the way my parents treated me, they definitely didn't see creative as being a career. And it was everyone else went into career. Well, people like Bowie, I knew that you could do something with being creative. You didn't have... So I got a lot of stick off them for not why don't you work in catering or something? Do you know what I mean? It was that bad, and I was like... Then when punk rock came along, I was like 17, sod you, I'm saving the train fare and getting out of here. Punk gave me... Bowie was the key, And punk rock was the like, well, sod you actually. I'm going over there. I want to go and look at Jordan, thank you, at Vivian's shop. That's where I want to be. But then I was a bit cocky at 17.
Yeah.
And I just legged it.
So you're on the train off, leaving
Literally.
Exeter station off to London, one-way
Night
ticket.
before, I stayed at someone's house, dyed my hair orange, got on the train, came up, knew one person in London, stayed there. Second day, I went down to Vivian's shop. Vivian flogged me a pair of bondage trousers and a destroyed T-shirt, and that was it. I'd see you later.
That's one of those tales I don't want to let go of, which is that you're the first fashion item that you bought, as it were, from a store like this, involved you being served by Vivienne Westwood.
I know, because Jordan and everyone else, and Debbie and everyone who was in the shop, I mean, they couldn't be bothered. And then Vivian came out the back and they were like, you know, there's a lad trying to buy a pair of bondage trousers. So Vivian ended up, showing me what the straps did, and Jordan and the rest of them were all like gassing. I was so frightened anyway.
I was going to say, great detail, please tell me what it was like to... Is this sex or is this seditionaries?
Just when seditionaries opened, they just changed it. I was aware of it in Exeter, of course, and they literally just changed it into seditionaries. It was when I ran away and came here. But it was really intimidating. I mean, I was a 17-year-old green boy. I knew this is where I should be, but I didn't know them or anything. I remember when I was, I'm being a bit younger. I was at middle school when punk broke, and we were scared of it as children. I think I actually wanted to know more about it, whereas most people saw it as violent, offensive, really, actually quite menacing. You know, punk wasn't some sort of thing you collect or look back on with fondness or but the way people treated you on the street, it wasn't now where you don't bat an eyelid if someone with blue hair walks by you, but back then, I mean, you were scaring old ladies on the bus, you know what I mean? They just didn't understand why young people wanted to do that to themselves, so you were immediately a challenge. And that shop was a challenge. You really had to, you know, grab hold of yourself and go in, even though the people were lovely, funnily enough. In the end, they were like you, young people just causing trouble.
Did you go to the concerts? Did you go to see the bands? Was it the music side to this?
Well, I came to London, and in my stupidity, or naivety, I thought I'd dye my hair orange, I've got me mad. I mean, in Exeter, we couldn't get any kind of punk clothes, so we made our own. So a friend of mine worked out how to do screen printing, so we used to screen print our own T-shirts or rip up our clothes and join them back together again, the DIY kind of thing. You know, I'm sure we looked like a load of yokels to the Vivienne Westwood people, but I mean, to us, that was our way of joining in. But I suppose Vivienne was the first proper fashion that I ever bought. I mean...
But it's interesting to talk
We
about...
did go to the gigs. You had to go to the gigs. I wasn't crazy about the music, to tell you the truth. But it wasn't really just about the music, was it?
It was many things, wasn't it?
It was about the attitude.
It was the making and the DIY and the being...
I mean, I saw some great bands. The Slits used to be my favourite, and the Clash were always great. Susie was always great. But it was more, it didn't matter whether they could play or not. You were in the right place for you,
Yeah.
I mean, there wasn't like, I thought I'd run away from home, go to Vivian's shop, and I'd make a whole set of friends.
Yeah.
Well, we were all giving it so much attitude that we couldn't be bothered to meet each other a lot of the time. And I was like, well, I'm not going backwards. So where else can I go? And the only other place I knew anyone was Manchester. So after about a week in London, I did get to see Iggy Pop, and I did get to see a few of the bands. I got the train to Manchester, and where I knew some students, friends from Exeter that were going to university up there. And the first night I arrived in Manchester, and we were all living in this horrible student flat in Moss Side. There was Susie and the Banshees and Johnny and the Heartbreakers were playing a gig. And I went to this gig, and then I started meeting people. It didn't have the kind of snobbery of London in it, where it was a bit more cliquey. You were either part of the Vivian's Pistols lot, or you were part of that lot. Whereas in Manchester, it was more kind of...
You just met.
Yeah, you just met. Yeah. I mean, I was lucky. I met Malcolm Garrett the first night I was there, and through Malcolm, I met the Buzzocks and Linder and people. Yeah. That was the scene up there, or the Fall, or Manchester had its own thing going on. So I stayed there for about 18 months, almost 2 years. And all the London bands used to come up, but you had a chance to meet them properly then, because they weren't in London being, you know, loud and proud. They were appreciated to get a gig outside London, half the bands, because they were like banned, you know what I mean? It was...
And I mean, just going back a bit there in terms of your region, I loved your description of sort of like the regional punk look, you know, being a bit yokel, as it were, as you came into London. But is this the beginning of something in terms of the making of things? And I'm thinking safety pins and that putting together of things, and also buying clothes from second-hand shops. I mean, you could go into...
Jumble sales was our thing in Manchester.
Yeah.
We'd go to the jumble sale and find some weird plastic mat from some woman in the 50s or something, and just completely massacre it, and then wear that out. You know, jumble sales was how we did it. And then for me personally, I used to change my hair colour every week. Like when your dole check came in, straight to go and get the bleach and the crazy colour or whatever. So I'd be like blue, pink. Each week you kind of, until it fell out once in the sink. But I mean, that was part of it, you know.
I mean, punk was a movement you could really join it, couldn't you? I mean, you'd join in to an extent, I guess. I mean, you felt that it was very British and very accessible in certain ways.
I think the reason, especially me, I mean, I do see it as my kind of foundation, in a way, because I loved making things. I always had as a kid. I'd always drawn a lot, and hours reading, anything like that. Like a physical activity. I mean, reading isn't, but I found it very relaxing. Listening to records. You know, I was lucky to meet people like Malcolm, and Peter Saville was at college with Malcolm. They were just about to leave college doing their final. So I was meeting top quality people. And I wasn't that educated about, especially art. So through people like Malcolm and Peter, and, you know, I learned about Bauhaus and Warhol, more about Warhol. I only knew the Velvet Underground side of it. And, you know, Linder was playing a lot with kind of imagery and stuff. And I was lucky. We were educating ourselves. I mean, it was a bit, you know, no more heroes ripping up the past and trying to invent a future, because it was a bit dull and grey at the time, England. It wasn't all sparkly and nice. We were reacting against our environment, but we wanted to do it with creativity. I think that's why punk was so important. Might have looked shocking, but in fact we were just trying to rip it up and start again. It was that mentality, or especially in Manchester up north, you know, it was the first time I'd really been in contact with black people through the reggae, because they used to play the reggae at the punk gigs. And the shebeens and those clubs were the only clubs that would let the punks in. So we used to end up going to all these like really rough clubs in Moss Side and Whalley Range or wherever in Manchester. And they were like hardcore reggae clubs. But they used to let us in because it was like, they obviously felt a rebel of affinity.
People sometimes overlook that. I saw yesterday Dennis Morris was showing me images of Johnny Rotten in U-Roy's back garden in Trenchtown, and it was it was very interesting, that relationship between punk and reggae. And
well, Don started it off at the Roxy, didn't he? Because there wasn't any punk records, so Don used to play his old dub records and old reggae records, because at least there were records. The band's playing. You know, you were going to see bands that probably didn't even have a bloody record contract. They just, well, they'd only formed 10 minutes ago and couldn't play the instruments anyway, so they just got out there and bashed it out. And then what we're going to do for the rest of the evening? Better stick a couple of reggae records on. It was the dumb thing, you know.
Tell me about the move back. I'm presuming the move back from Manchester was to London, and that you.
Yeah. Well, I ended up in Malcolm Garrett. When I first went there, we couldn't all stay at this student flat. There was I had to sleep under a table, and the landlord was forever coming round. We all used to have to hide in cupboards and stuff and pretend we weren't there, because there was only supposed to be 2 people living there. And at various times, you know, there'd be like 12, just sleeping on everything. So Malcolm went, I've got a house, and he had a house above a fish shop in Rusholme. And he went, there's a room going there. So I ended up moving into Malcolm's house. I stayed there for quite a long time. And Malcolm, by then, he'd started, the Buzzocks were like really our big band. They were the big band from Manchester. The Buzzocks and the Fall were really the 2 big bands. Everyone went to go. There was other ones. Linder had Ludus, and there was my other favourite one, The Worst, who really were the worst, but they were so great. Slaw and the Dogs and whatever. And Malcolm started doing the Slee. Once he'd left college, him and Peter had left college, Peter went off with Tony Wilson and started up Factory. And Malcolm started doing the Buzzcocks sleeves on his bedroom floor, funnily enough. That Orgasm Addict one, I remember it being on the bedroom floor with Malcolm working out the
Which is the Linder picture.
Yeah, with the Linder collage on. And then he got a gig. There was a guy called Andrew Lauder in London who used to do a record company called Radar Records. They were in Covent Garden. And they had quite good people on their roster. It was more new wave now than punk. Like 78. And I don't know, punk was really running out of the energy. It became a bit too yobbo in a kind of fun. Well, Johnny always used to say when the leather jacket came in, it died. And everyone turned up in combat pants and a leather jacket and a fake Mohican. Well, it died, because before it, the last thing you wanted to do was look like someone else. That's why the characters are so strong in punk rock, the original ones, because you didn't want to really look like someone else. But once it had developed and it became more of a uniform, it kind of... Anyway, that 78-ish era, Malcolm started coming down to London to work at Radar Records. And it was getting a bit slow in Manchester at the time. Everyone was travelling, the bands were travelling. It was less a homegrown thing. They were all starting to tour and things like that. So Malcolm was like, shove your stuff in the back. I've got a van outside, shove it in the back of the van. We're moving to London. So I was like, okay. I didn't have hardly anything anyway.
Yeah.
And we moved to this hideous flat in the 15th floor of a tower block on the Isle of Dogs. And I lived in the cupboard there for about, I don't know, a year or something. So yeah, we came down to London and I just odd jobbed it a bit. And then the new romantic kind of era, Radar Records was behind the Blitz. And Steve took Visage to Radar. So they first started so the Blitz was the next street over. And that's when I first met Princess Julia, when she was a shop girl in PX. We were both like 18 or whatever.
So you were almost living above Blitz at this point, more or less.
Well, we weren't living there, but we were working there, because Malcolm was working at Radar, and when I was desperate for money, I used to do odd jobs for him. And
Yeah. Tell us about Blitz. I mean, what was that about?
I didn't go millions of times. Well, getting there from the Isle of Dogs really dressed up just wasn't good fun. It was something else. I went there with Derek Jarman. Derek always used to take me, normally, when I was hanging out with Derek. And it was good fun.
And how did you get to hang out with Derek Jarman?
Yeah.
How did you get to hang out with him?
I had a job in a nightclub as a coat check boy. And Derek chatted me up. And then obviously, so it didn't work out in the bed, but he just really liked me and I adored him. So he ended up really, what Derek used to do is kind of look after cute boys and show them the world.
Yeah.
And I was really eager for it. He used to introduce you to really useful people and just such a special person.
When I talk to people like John Maybury or even people like Gareth Wynne Evans or people like yourself, Derek seems to be this sort of, you know, if you trace back the family tree, it sort of leads back to Derek somehow in this city, you know.
Well, that's where I first met, like, as well as the Blitz, John and Kerith, and they were part of the squat Carburton Street scene with George and Marilyn and, you know, Stephen and Julia, and it was all kind of revolving. And Derek was right opposite St. Martin's on Charing Cross Road, that tiny flat there. And amazing the people I met there.
Did you go to the flat in Charing Cross Road often? He had film screenings there, didn't he? And he often...
It wasn't that big.
Yeah.
What Derek always used to call me up and go, like of a Saturday, and we'd walk down the King's Road. Do you know what I mean? And we'd always pop in and see Jordan at Vivian shop, whatever the shop was doing, because that was such a meeting place as well. Or, you know, you just walk up the King's Road. I remember once there's me in a, you know, naked boy t-shirt and leather chaps on, and Derek's introducing me to Sir Frederick Ashton. You know what I mean? It was that kind of madness. You know, and then I'd go to tea with Sir Fred and Derek and meet all these kind of... Derek knew everyone.
Does Boy George come into that picture or later?
I never liked George when I first met him. I thought he was a naff queen. And we used to take the piss out of him a bit, because he used to, I'm going to be a huge star. And we were like, yeah, right. And then, boy, did we have to swallow our words like a year and a half later when he was like #1 everywhere. We didn't really get on that well, bitchy queens at nightclubs. But then when he really started, the first time he got successful, Helen Terry, who used to sing with him, brought him over to my studio. And George was like a magpie. He just hoovered up the jewellery. I think he walked out with most of it and, you know, started wearing. And then once we started working together, we got on. I don't know, maybe we were just... I mean, it was funny that you didn't always get on with the people until you didn't even give yourself time to meet them half the time, because the outfit was the challenge, wasn't it? It was like, well, look better than her at least, you know. Kind of, there was a lot of kind of snippy competition.
That kind of kept it all, it kind of galvanised everything.
Well, it made you better at it.
Yeah.
Because you had competition going on.
I mean, the nation sort of looked in on it for a while, because Marilyn, who you described earlier, who was close with Boy George, became subject of front page headlines. I mean, you would read about these people like cartoon characters running around London begging for money for heroin outside a tube station. You know, that would be the front page news at one point.
I mean,
bizarre.
Now when you think back on it, we all used to go out, but we'd spend all day getting ready.
Yeah.
And then it was literally pooling your 10p's to go out. It makes me laugh now. How did I go out and get the late bus home? Like, you know.
I mean, that London scene became particularly well known. We've definitely got to come to that. But I wanted to just pick up on something you said about your studio. So we're now, let's say, late 70s, early 80s, and you had a...
Julia says it's 78 when we first met, so it must have been when I first came to London. And if Malcolm had been working at Radar, PX was in Covent Garden, Blitz was on the next street. The only other place where a lot of people congregated was Kensington Market and the King's Road.
Yeah.
So if you weren't in Covent Garden at the time, like as a dressed up youngster, you'd parade down the King's Road still, and then there'd be like all the markets, and like Vivian's shop was always like the full stop of the King's Road kind of thing, where...
Tell us about, I mean, at this point, are you making jewellery? Are you seeing yourself as...
I always have made the jewellery. It's like my little backbone to it.
Yeah. When did you start, for instance, when you were...
It was about the Blitz. I mean, punk days, we did used to forge together our outfits from whatever we had around, or... But when it was like the new romantic time, and we were going out to nightclubs and parties quite a lot, you know, Andrew Logan always seemed to have a party on, or, you know, there was a lot of social scenes. A lot of the people were at St. Martin's learning fashion, so we were all experimenting wildly with the way we looked. I think it was a reaction towards the punk thing when it became very uniform.
Yeah.
And we were a group of people, we didn't want to be uniform. You know, we all wanted to be different from each other. But we were all doing it on tiny budgets. And me and my friend Scarlett, we found the best way of doing it is David Holer used to make this thing called the chemise, which was basically a long, lots of fabric at the neck, lots of fabric here, and it was like a long dress to about below your knees, and it was a great shape. Well, me and Scarlett had loads of those. They were like 20 quid, I think, or 14 quid or something at the time, which was quite a lot of money. And then Scarlett started, I'd made that black bead necklace, which I gave to Scarlett, which was basically this huge, just millions of black beads that completely covered the whole of Scarlett's front. That was the first piece of jewellery I made. And from that, it was like, God, well, if I made a different piece every week and we wore the chemise, it would look like a different outfit. So then the next week I made something out of string. And then a couple of weeks later, bones. You know what I mean? So that's when I started making accessories. Then people like Suzanne Barch were coming into town, and Suzanne was very much on that kind of scene, and very Chelsea with Michael and Galinda. And then Suzanne had a funny little shop in New York, so I used to make a few things for her to take back to New York. And then I thought, well, I'd never trained as anything. So I thought I'd give it a go.
And this is when you became a cottage industry.
I still am.
But what's really fascinating about that?
I just happen to be a leg end and an icon as well now, but...
Important to be a leg end.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to say very briefly that when you mentioned the bones in the jewellery, how did you get these materials? Where were you finding them?
Well, we used to mudlark. Go down to the Thames at certain points, and it was great for pieces of old metal, beaten up metal, bones, clay pipes, anything like that. Thames, I mean, there's that picture of me and John Moore and lots of us. We used to, it was like a good day out, that. Go and see what we could find at the river, or...
What's the weirdest thing you ever found over there?
I don't know. I always used to be a bit worried about the bones because I never really knew what they were from. Or I used to invent stories about them being like hundreds of years old. Like, I mean, they could have been plague victims or something. I was thinking I'm going to disease some fashion victim in a minute.
and you and the bottle tops became
Bottle
rings.
tops were rings. Because I didn't have any training. I didn't go to fashion college, even though I was mixing with a lot of fashion people. I didn't have any parameters about what I used for it. So it was normally something from my environment or something I found. It wasn't. So it was dictated to with what I could get hold of. Which I think that's what made it different. There was one other person doing it independent of me. I didn't know him at the time. It's Tom Binns was doing a similar thing. I mean, Tom was always a swine saying I ripped him off, but I didn't even know who he was. I didn't know, you know, it was just one of those coincidences that happened. So I think that's what added to it. And that was very much, I was still I see it as carrying on that punk aesthetic where you did take a safety pin or a padlock or a plug or anything and fashion it into part of your look. It's also quite tribal, I think, in a way.
Who was buying the jewellery?
I don't know, Suzanne was buying it. Not many people here. We were using it to advertise ourselves. I think I had, you know, obviously the odd person. Scarlett, I always used to make stuff for her. Gradually built up a quite small little clientele of different people. But I mean, really, the most important thing was looking bloody fabulous to go out. You know, it wasn't like, oh, let's take orders. You know what I mean? It was sod that.
And so a combination of maybe the dole and a bit of income from the jewellery was what kept you going at this time, or?
Well, I always say that's why we all invented up these ridiculous names, because we were all signing on in our real ones at the time.
Tell us about, I mean, just very briefly, John, you mentioned John Moore, and that there's a wonderful picture of you and him. Mudlarking. And tell us about John. Yeah.
Well, I first met John, Heaven had opened. While the New Romantic thing, they redid Heaven nightclub, and it hadn't been open long. And we got jobs there. Me and John used to work the coat check with Michael, our friend. There was 3 coat checks. I was on one side and John and Michael were on the other side. Well, the longer we worked there, we almost made the coat check into its own nightclub, separate from the rest of the nightclub, you know. I mean, Derek, that's when I first met Derek. Derek used to come here and just park on the edge of my counter, and we just, there was almost like a coat check crew. I was shameless. We rarely dress up. Not like the rest of the queens were all kind of like clones. It's when the clone thing came in and everyone else is walking around with a moustache and a check shirt and wear.
Because that was the predominant gay look at the time, in as much as it was a huge movement, the clone movement.
Yeah, leather or
but it was the tasselled loafers,
and,
an MA1 jacket, big tash. And Geoffrey Hinton once pointed out something very interesting, I felt, which was that idea that Taboo was really a sort of fashion club, and also a club in which certainly Geoffrey and many of his friends, no doubt yourself, but Leigh Bowery, etc., couldn't get into gay clubs at that time.
Well, it changed.
Yeah.
Heaven could be a successful clone club. And then we caused trouble in the coat check. And then at one point, because they'd seen Blitz and Steve was opening other things as well, there was another club called Hell that Steve opened, and then another one called Club for Heroes. And they saw the New Romantic thing as, oh, maybe we could make some money out of it. Then they asked me, Scarlett and Michael to open up on a Tuesday night, which would be a dead night for most nightclubs. They gave us the leather bar on the side of the Heaven, and we called it Cha-Cha's. And it had its own entrance down a back alleyway, and Scarlett used to sit on the door and go, even though there was only 10 people in, and we used to keep most of them outside just to make it seem busy. And gradually that really took off. And the good thing about it is you could go to Cha-Cha's and they'd let you into the rest of the nightclub, but you couldn't go the other way. So if you'd gone in the clone entrance, you couldn't get into Judges, but you could go the other way. And then gradually, everyone started coming to Judges. I mean, it was like Marilyn, George, all the designers. That's where I first met Antony Price, who was really the first designer that I worked with. I mean, it was a bloody good laugh. It was just before Taboo.
Yeah.
Leigh, that was the first one that Leigh really came. I mean, Leigh arrived on the door and he was wearing this brown priest coat to the thing and horrible haircut, no makeup. And Scarlett just liked the look of him, so let him in. And that was like the start of it for Leigh, is right. I mean, literally from when he was working in the McDonald's or Burger King or whatever and just come from Australia going, I've got to go where these people are.
And John Moore, where did you...
Well, me and John were working the coat check.
Just, and
we ended up living together in Brixton.
Yeah.
We all had... I was squatting on Railton Road and he had a tiny little flat in Tulse Hill. So we always used to go to work together, go back home at any hour.
And what about these other characters who start to... I mean, at which point does House of Beauty and Culture begin to form?
It was after Chachas, and it was the time of Taboo, because it was open then. And by that point, you know, I was working with like ID and The Face, just starting to do that. Those magazines were coming to record this kind of thing.
And this is stylist work?
Well, we didn't even really know it was styling. It was just helping organise looks for pages in magazines, or like ID was very much, you know, they came to Chachas and just photographed people dancing one time in one of like issue 2 or whatever. There's them just hanging out at Chachas.
I mean, people could spend a whole day at Kensington Market just waiting, hoping that an ID photographer might come along and get them, snap them in some outfit, which would then
and they
appear.
probably would. I mean,
ID was the thing, wasn't it, at that time? It felt so important to see. If you ever saw yourself in ID, it was a big day.
Yeah, it was a big day. Face was a bit more organised. But what Terry did with that, and the people helping him out when that first happened, yeah, funny.
And ID was fashion, wasn't it? I mean, that's the difference. Face tended to go off into music directions and become a bit music industry, I think, whereas ID always had an eye on a look.
Well, there were a lot of looks going down at the time. We weren't short of looks.
How did it bring you? Where is Buffalo in all of this? Is this coming in? I mean, Taboo takes up quite a serious chunk of everyone's time, I suspect.
Well, I mean, Taboo was just something else. I don't know. There was something about Leigh and Taboo and Sue Tilley on the door and Mark Vautier taking the money and Mark Vautier on the door. It was just one of those clubs where, of a Thursday night, you knew you could go down there, you'd see Galliano, Julia, you know, everyone went on a certain scene. It was such a laugh. And people really, because Leigh Bowery ran it, I mean, people really made an effort. Not that you could ever compete with Leigh, because the minute he thought someone's getting the edge on him, he just invent something else, and everyone would go, well, there's no point, really. We're never going to beat that.
It's an amazing time as well because of St. Martin's being around the corner. There's Peter Doig there, there's art school kids there, as well as, you know, and those art schools have fashion as a component, but there's also painters. And
I mean, an important person is Suzanne Bartsch, because she started taking some of us to New York and we started doing shows there. And it really made kind of people, especially like the press, sit up and take us a bit more seriously here. The fact that Suzanne took us somewhere else to do it. By then, a lot of the people, like from the New Romantic era, that had been through St. Martin's and all the fashion, Middlesex and all the fashion colleges, were actually, we were all trying to start these little companies, like independent, our own companies, not going and working.
And also, I mean, that media really helped, it struck me. I mean, you saw Leigh on TV suddenly, on, you know, the Clothes Show or something, and it seemed like that was, as unlike before, this very niche nightclub scene was getting exposure suddenly.
Yeah, all the time. And I wish I knew that. I'm trying to find it. My friend Alan thought he had it, but there used to be a tape I had of VHS, and I used to call it Carry On Judy Blame, because it was like German TV, English TV, you know, it was, we survived doing media sometimes, you know. That's what fed us.
What were people, I mean, I suspect it was the look, and people were sensing that there was something coming out of London then, which was really distinct from punk and post-punk, and it was definitely a moment for clothes and a certain look, and there was a certain hedonism.
It was definitely a moment for clothes.
Yeah.
I mean, there was people like Stephen Jones was really getting it together, and he was all from the New Romantic thing. He was important for people's looks. You know, it had crossover from the glam thing with Antony Price and people like that were like crossover, and Andrew and Dougie and all those people were like from, it was the bridge over the two things, the New Romantic thing.
And you had Stephen Linnard, you had Rachel
Linnard, genius.
Yeah, Rachel Orban.
Yeah.
And obviously John Moore with the shoes and so on, and that sense of, I mean, there were many characters at this point.
And they all had their own look with the clothes. Suzanne nicked it and did it in shows we did New York and we did Tokyo, funnily enough. Michael Kostiff was working with Suzanne on doing the shops and helping kind of art direct the shows a bit. And I mean, it was really the age of character, wasn't it? If you look back at it now, we all had our own thing going on to different, varying degrees. And we all used to hang out together. Michael's dancing, I mean, that was breathtaking what Michael was doing at the time. And music was more eclectic. But then George and all of that stuff, Hazy Fantasy, you know, we started having our own pop stars. It was such a fertile
And Jeffrey
time.
DJ.
Jeffrey, the DJs all coming up.
That's right, yeah.
You know, John and Kerris films and
what do people do? People were coming. Where were you selling your clothes at that point, or your jewellery at that point, and how?
Well, sometimes we did it in Ken Market. Sometimes we did it.
There's that shop site in Berwick Street, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And people are coming to you asking you to style them now. Are you getting proper?
Well, you'd meet them out.
Yeah.
Most of them.
Yeah.
Or if someone was doing a video or something, it would be like, you wouldn't come and make a costume for this, you know, video, or George, you know, George kept me busy for a while because he was a massive global superstar at one point. Well, he still is.
And you styled him in the Blitz magazine picture with the Kentucky Fried Chicken bag.
You know, you were always busy. It wasn't like we were lazy. People always think you just spent all day just dressing up. Well, sometimes we did, but I mean, it's actually, looking back on it, we didn't see it as work because we really enjoyed it, but in fact it was quite hard work.
It also felt like the London scene then was getting a lot of recognition, mainly from New York and Japan and Tokyo, but also it was beginning to move into, as you say, pop videos and commercial areas that at least meant you got a paycheck maybe once in a while.
Yeah. I mean, I've never been interested in money, so I've never had loads of it, but I mean, whatever, that wasn't my motivation, but you know, and then when people like Galliano come, when, you know, a talent like that surfaces, you know, you can't ignore it. You know, some of the talent that was coming up there's just breathtaking, still is.
And this is a period as well of designer clothes, isn't it?
And everyone used to kind of, the youngsters will probably get really bored with me saying this, but I always say it, but there was such camaraderie between people. You know, I mean, I worked at the same time I was working with Chris Nemeth. I did, in fact, do shows and stuff with Galliano at the same, you know what I mean? Or if Body Map were doing a show and they were short of a few models, well, go to Taboo and ask a few people. You know,
I was going to say it's a time when we were all borrowing each other's tools, but you had to sort of somehow get the thing going, and you never had it all to start with, so.
But now everyone's so kind of cliquey and it's mine.
Yeah.
Whereas then it's like, what, do you need a hand? You know, John Mabry's doing the Super 8 film. You wouldn't do a come over and...
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure, John. Pay me bus fare, I'll be there, you know.
And to my mind in that period, I mean, House of Beauty and Culture and Nemeth especially, what you were doing, what Alan MacDonald was doing, it all became really very hot.
Well, it had a home at House of Beauty and Culture because that's when the East End was like nothing, really, but it was cheap.
Yeah.
Leigh was in Aldgate, we were just near Dalston. You know, a lot of the people, Burnstock and Spears were up the road there, and, you know, a lot of people had their work studios around the East End. I mean, there was nothing else.
Yeah.
And then when John found the building, and it had studio and shop downstairs, it was like, and we were all mixing. I was working with Chris, John was making shoes, you know. It was a time where we had a little home for it. You know, Trojan painted the sign, and Alan, Fritz and Alan were just up the road making their furniture. So that, of course, went in. You know, it was very much, let's just go for it. And
describe that to me if you can, in terms of like, imagine it on a given day as you walk in, what would you experience?
Well, you know, Chris could turn up with a bin liner full of jackets he'd just made.
Post office.
Me and John were working quite a lot upstairs. John bashing out shoes, me bashing out a bit of jewellery. People would either come in and say just to pop by because they were in the area.
Alan mentioned the change on the floor, the money on the floor.
Yeah.
You had to tread through, crunch over.
Yeah, it made a
coppers.
sound.
Yeah.
It made a sound. I wanted to do that in Dover Street, but they wouldn't let me do it because of the insurance these days, because if some kind of rich bastard skidded on it and broke their leg or something in Dover Street, they'd sue him for...
I think, was it Alan who told me the once that two people had come from Japan and had gone to the shop and had mysteriously been let in, but everyone seemed to be...
John!
Yeah, you must
let two die-hard fans from Japan came. And John let them into the shop, and then I don't know, I think I was upstairs. And then one thing led to another, and John just forgot. Well, he thought, to stop shoplifting, I'll just lock them in, and then I'll come back down and see if they want to buy anything. Well, we forgot that they were in the shop, and these poor Japanese were still in the shop, like hours later, patiently waiting
to be let out.
They were too polite to like scream and shout and bang on something. And these poor people were like locked in the House of Beauty and Culture for the whole day. They were lucky we didn't go out to a nightclub. They would have come back to two little skeletons wearing Chris Nemeth in the shop. Probably used them as a window display.
I know it was a very friendly place, etc. But I just tell me about the items that came out of there, which you might say have real lasting value. I mean, for instance, the post office jackets or your badges. I mean, it was a birthplace of some design craft classics, I think.
We didn't think so at the time. Things were a bit more immediate then. It wasn't part of a big plan. It was just a kind of fever that we caught off each other. You know, you couldn't help being, you know, when Chris used to turn up with his funny little bin liners full of, you know, and he'd make this is out one of my old paintings, or a post sack with a piece of carpet on it, and then Richard Torrey was making all those lovely knitwear. You know, we just kind of sparked each other off. The most exciting thing was what everyone else was doing, which made you want to make more stuff. I don't know, it was a kind of collective fever, I suppose, of creativity.
I mean, just on Nemeth, you said you'd been to Japan not long ago and you'd seen an archive of his books, and obviously you and Christopher were very close and sometimes shared sketchbooks. And
well, I was starting to be a lot more educated about fashion when I met Chris. Chris didn't really know anything about fashion. He'd come from a fine art background. So I was really one of the first people to give him fashion education, me and Mark Le Bon. And we were lucky to have Mark there because he recorded quite a lot of it. So yeah, for me that was the big, I mean, I loved working with Galliano, but we didn't do it all the time. But with Chris, it was a meeting of minds. I don't know. That was the clothes. I didn't have to make clothes because Chris made the clothes I liked, and then I made things to go with them, or would influence him about fabric beyond the post sack or one of his old paintings.
Yeah. Talk a little about that, because it's still, sometimes people they will remember the post office sacks, but there was a moment when Chris was just taking the old paintings off and pattern cutting them into jackets, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, he couldn't sell the paintings, and he liked the colour, or he liked the surface, and he also liked the way they wore. You know what I mean? Yeah. The way they changed the more you wear them. I mean, that was one of the glorious things about Christopher's clothes, were you'd buy them and they were such great patterns that they actually became your jacket because they wore out on you, you know what I mean? And they almost looked better the more worn out. Now everyone expects everything to be clean and dry cleaned and immaculate, whereas the wearing of it out was part of it, part of its charm. something Chris never lost. They still look great 25, whatever years later, some of those things. I mean, I was practically in tears when I looked back through the archive because I remembered every single jacket. You know, normally you can remember your wardrobe in times or in waves. Well, when I looked back through Chris's archive, I was like, God, that's the first time he used even his family, because I've got the information, they weren't even there. And it was like, look, I could remember those clothes, jacket by jacket. And I started putting it into, you know, some kind of order. There was too much of it to do it all, but one day it will happen, and you can really see it's unusual with fashion to be able to do it like that. You can do it with art, and you can even do it with music, I think, sometimes. But with fashion, it's so fast a lot. But with someone like Chris's work, you can really see the journey.
Tell us a bit about, I know this is a nerdy question, but the badge machines that you bought, where did you get these from?
Well, funnily enough, when ID first started, Terry Jones, there was a shop in Covent Garden called Better Badges. And Terry, they used to sort all the pages out for ID and staple it up in the basement of Better Badges. And even funnier than that, that was Neneh Cherry's first job when she came to this country when she was like 15 or whatever, was stapling ID together in the basement of Better Badges. And I used to go to Better Badges because I've always loved the badge. And then when I was starting to work with Chris, and then I managed to persuade the guy who ran Better Badges to, could you make a badge out of this? So I'd take old cigarette foils and milk bottle tops, and then in the end Mark and Bob went, oh fucking hell, we should go buy our own machine, really. And it was bolted to the desk at Mark's studio, so we used to go in and find whatever. Do you think we'll get this through the badge machine? You know what I mean? Oh yeah, it works, great. And then we bang out. That's how they they became linked to the clothes a bit more, because we were like, do you think we'll get this through the machine?
And eventually you had it at the House of Beauty and Culture, or were you always using
I think
Mark's?
It was always at Mark's, and then Better Badges closed after a while, but he used to make a lot of them for me, and I used to be able to go in there and go, will this work?
I know this, I mean, I hope this isn't painful in any way or so on, but John Moore obviously was quite together by the sounds of things, certainly helped keep House of Beauty and Culture together in terms of the logistics of renting a space, and then sadly passed away, which must have been an awful moment. I don't think...
It was just shit timing. I mean, I remember being in Paris, because we were all starting to make an inroad somewhere. I'd started styling as well as making the jewellery. I was even going to Paris, which was quite a thing. And I remember I came back from Paris on one trip to pick up clothes. And Cindy Palmano actually called me up and went, Jude, John's dead. I was like, oh, get away with you. I saw him the other day. What are you talking about? And he had died, and it was a complete shock. And we were all we were on the verge of something. It was just shit timing. If we, I mean, I know it's a horrible thing to say, but if he hadn't have died, it would have been we could have gone to the next level. We were about to go to the next level. Then and then I introduced Chris to his Japanese wife, Keiko. And then Chris went to Japan. So for me, it was a really difficult time where I was losing my soulmates. You know what I mean? Even though we never really looked at ourselves as a gang, we were in a funny kind of way. Fritz and Alan, me, John, Richard, Torrey, Chris were really kind of the gang. And without them, it all just...
But then, in a way, also, after House of Beauty and Culture, you spoke about Neneh, Cherry for a moment there, but then is this the moment where the styling really takes off in a way?
Well, that was when I was a bit lost after John left. And even when Chris moved to Japan, but I was lucky I had Mark Le Bon there. And Mark really filled that gap for me. And I lost a bit of my feeling towards making the jewellery and went more into the style side of it. And then started working with Mark more on little films and photographs and stuff. I was still working a bit with Chris. I mean, Chris used to come backwards and forwards. And I was still advising him, and you know, sometimes we did go to Japan, or we'd dream up little projects to do together, like a film or a... So Mark, I suppose, really filled the gap of John going. And I did get more seriously into doing the styling of it. I started becoming almost more known for a stylist, even though I never gave up the jewellery, and I never have. Just depends whether I decide to sell it or not, or it's always included in my work somewhere, or it's always the starting point for an idea. You know, it's either a sketchbook or a piece of jewellery that can lead on to something else. You know, it's like... So
it's like a little model for something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That funny little idea, and then, you know, 8 months later you're doing something based around that funny... It's kind of like my touchstone for the creativity kind of thing is... Because I'm very physical about how I generate the ideas. It has to come from something that I'm quite touchy-feely, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
And so Mark Le Bon brought you into the, I suspect, more into the mainstream of ID style, something like that.
Well, also, the other big crew around then, that's when I did first meet Ray Petri as well, you see. And between Mark and Ray, Ray always used to say to me, "You're good with clothes, Jude. You should do it." Because I used to help Ray with some of his shoots. He'd call up and go, "Jude, come on, I'm shooting tomorrow. Bring a box of chains and some, and I want it to be all like this." And I'd turn up with my box of tricks. And then when Ray used to go, "I need something there, like a badge or a brooch, or I need a chain going." And he was the don of it.
How
star-wise.
How established was Ray at that time? I mean, how well known? I mean, you were coming up to him as...
Well, the face things really set the... You know, they used to be like Ray doing his face thing. They used to be Amanda Harlick and Amanda was doing the Galliano Harper's and Queen thing with Camilla Nicholson. You know, there was certain, Venetia was just starting up and Jürgen cropped up around that time. So,
very, very different scene, isn't it? Perhaps more West London and a bit more centred around Notting Hill, and a move away from, let's say, Kingsland Road and
looking
Taboo.
back on it now, I realise John going, and I lost a bit of the East End thing. Maybe I was looking for more of an escape, and you know, it was more West London. Ray was surrounded by a really great group of people. Mark was surrounded by a great group of people. That's when I first started meeting Neneh, and the music thing was a bit more powerful, whereas I'd say before that I was more of a fashion person.
Yeah.
Then we started getting into doing the videos and the visuals and stuff for music people. I'd already done a bit of George, and George was up and running by then. It almost became more music.
Yeah.
I mean, probably everyone was a bloody pop star. They were all bloody designer before then, and then gradually it was kind of, even though it was always intertwined, everyone, I'd say it was more of a music styling time.
And it was more savvy in a way, wasn't it? At least it felt like it was less, you know, less
spontaneous, maybe.
Less
Let's
of the
put it like
squats
that.
and more of the I've got a meeting tomorrow sort of thing. I don't
Well,
know.
we were still shameless. I mean, we'd go to Paris and pretend we were really important, and you know, and the Parisians looking down their nose and us going, well, we don't care because we're much better looking than you are.
What do you think the lasting legacy of Buffalo is? I mean, Buffalo did become so pronounced a look.
What Ray started, the things, I mean, a lot of this, I mean, I can laugh about it now, and thank God I've still got my sense of humour about it. But at the time, because we weren't thinking about it at the time, we were doing it from ourselves. He was really important about bringing people of colour into the fashion business, but as the image, really important. His casting was like the best. And also what he did was the mixing the sportswear with high fashion. Jean-Paul Gaultier always says that Ray was a huge influence on the way that he looked at things. You know, because Ray would take like a really flash Italian suit jacket and mix it with a cycle pen. You know, at the time, everyone thought he was mad. But you look at anything, Ray was the first one to really use sportswear in a fashion context, not on a football pitch. Or, do you see what I mean?
Or in hip hop. I mean,
yeah.
And it's also, I mean, it's also a very fresh look. I mean, if you look at it even now, it still has a certain kind of, because it's mixed and matched often in a very
I mean, it
clean
does
way.
make me chuckle that there's a guy that looks like he's a boxer, but he's in fact in really quite a camp outfit. And I don't know how Ray trod that line where they don't really look, but I mean,
you always had that.
it actually quite camp, a lot of Ray's styling, but it was so thought out and so that it just, and he put it on the right face, it toughened up.
I think people come back to it from time to time. It still becomes a sort of touchstone. It's not fully gone away.
I'll tell you who really likes it now are the younger kids. There's like a gap in between that aren't sure, but actually young, fresh kids now, and you see how mixed England is now, are on it like a rash. They understand it straight away. But, you know, even my thing, the do-it-yourself, it's come. I'm sick to death of being brought back into fashion. You know what I mean? It's like, leave me alone. Not that I'm ever going to retire, but do you know what I mean? Those ideas come round where people look at it in a fresh way and go, actually.
Yeah. I mean, the thing of salvage and repurposing or change,
people used to think I was mad. I'd go, Terry Jones was like practically the only person that used to go, well, just do it.
Yeah.
Terry, I want to do a shoot about pollution. And I want them all to look like the birds being pulled out of the oily sea. And Terry would go, yeah, fine, do it. You know what I mean? No other editor would let you do that. You know, if you were passionate about it, he'd let you do it. And
why do you think young kids, as it were, do look again at Buffalo, or even at that collage and that way in which you make your work? What is interesting people about it again, do you think?
I thought about this a lot, working on this show for the ICA, and of course, like a cocky sod, you think, oh yeah, great, let's have a show at the ICA. And then I kind of went home and I thought, what am I going to put in it? And then it's really made me have to look at the work again. So out it all comes. And I was trying to think of a way that I could pull a thread around it and make it like, not one thing, because it's all different things. And I was thinking, well, I think the reason people associate themselves with my work or what I did is, one, I always tried to make them think about what they were looking at. I mean, I would take an idea like pollution and put it into a fashion context, which people don't normally do. So I'm not only working on a glamorous image, but there's a reason I've put it in. There's a fact, there's a reason. You have to think about it. You have to be attracted by it at first. And then if you can just make people think about it as well at the same time, instead of just flicking through a magazine. And that's why I think people associate a bit with my work, that it's not just on that level of a glamorous picture. There's something else going on. There's always something else going on. Or I'll take a piece of rubbish and I'll make it the chicest thing you've ever seen in your life. But it's made out of a carrier bag and a squashed can. But it looks like it could be haute couture in Paris. So it's that mixing. So people associate. So you can be a rich person looking at it thinking, oh, how chic. Or you can be a poor person looking at it going, well, I could make that. And in fact, I think that's why I've managed to drag myself through so many eras, is that you can always, there's always something else in it as well. It's not just on one level.
What does it create a picture of ultimately? Is it slightly apocalyptic, like out of the ruins, out of the rubble? I mean, the East End was still a bomb site when you started to hang out there.
Well, I think, I hate to have to say this, it sounds really flippant, but poverty is a kind of aphrodisiac, I think. You know, because you have to really think about what you're doing. If you're rich, you don't care about it. Whereas if you're taking it from you haven't got much, you're forced to use your imagination in a different way. And then it depends what your ultimate goal is, but it never worried me being poor. Because in fact, when my back's against the wall is when some of my best ideas come out. when I've got too much money in my pocket, I can get lazy. I mean, maybe that's just me, but, you know, if I had a big fat credit card, I'd be useless. I'd do about 3 things a year, but because I have to think about how much is on my Oyster card, I'm making shit all the time.
Just very, very briefly on this topic of you as a survivor of sorts, Judy, and forgive me, but
so it is quite apocalyptic,
yes.
In fact.
Yeah.
I'm not frightened of the future. I worry for it, and I worry for all the human beings, and I try to stimulate people. I don't know. I mean, I'm only one person, but one person can make a difference, you know. I'm that kind of era of person.
But it's not the compulsion to recycle, or is it more the, as you say, the compulsion to use these things which are freely available, which are trash, which are discarded?
Oh no, there's definitely something about the reusing something. I find if everything's too disposable, you start making all things disposable. Whereas if you can place value on something that has no value, I don't know, it's that whole passing on thing, using what you've got. Yeah, it is about the recycling.
I wanted to just ask about the survivor thing, forgive me, but what replaced Ray? Because that must have been such a killer after what you'd been through with John, that of course then Ray passes away. I mean...
Well, you have to understand that was like the 80s and the AIDS virus came through, which was a really tough time for everyone in the fashion business, and lots of different business, not just the fashion business, but I've kept one of my phone books from that era, and they're, you know, with Leigh's numbers in and Ray's numbers, and it's just, whew. I mean, I'm not saying I got blasé about death, it always affects me. But it was pretty all the time. You know, I was jumping backwards and forwards from London to New York, London to New York. Well, every time I went back to New York, they'd be like, well, rip another couple of pages out. And then you come back to London and someone else was ill. It was a really hideous time. And it wasn't like we were really getting any help about it. You know, the government's attitude was like, scare the living crap out of you, which is, I feel it's that kind of era now where the media and politicians just want to scare the shit out of you, do you know what I mean? With everything, the way they report it, the way it's all scaremongering, which really worries me. But Ray, John and then Ray, I don't know, for the last 20 years I've been through hell of a time losing the people that were in fact the closest to me, especially creatively. I'm not talking about them just as being good friends of mine, I'm talking about them as being collaborators and, you know, partners in crime.
Leigh's passing was equally shit timing, I thought, because he was really about to turn
absolutely rubbish.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to people like Catherine Evans and others, he was about to turn that corner into the art world. He would have been huge. Yeah, I mean that.
I remember I went to Japan, and someone in Japan, one of the Minty crew, Leigh's band, had this fantastic DVD of Leigh performing at a Minty gig, right? And I didn't go to the gig, but I saw this DVD, I thought, that is bloody brilliant. When he gave birth to Nicola, one of those gigs, right? Anyway, I came back. I flew back on Boxing Day from Japan. And I thought, I've got to tell him. So I called up Leigh's house. Hi, Leigh didn't answer the phone. His dad did. And I was like, what? Oh no, Leigh's had to go into, he's not very well, he's had to go into hospital. I was going, oh, well, you've just got to tell her. I saw this DVD in Japan. It's the bloody best thing. To give her my love. If she needs a visitor, tell her, blah, blah, blah. Judy Blame called, chatting to his dad for a bit. Put the phone down, didn't think of it. Went to a New Year's Eve party, and of course, Fat Tony walks in, go, Leigh's dead.
Yeah.
I just went, because he kept it so quiet.
Yeah.
There's me just like thinking, oh, right, oh, well, I'll see her soon. She's got a cough or something. She's in hospital, but. And then he died, what, the day before New Year's Eve, wasn't it? Or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Having married Nicola in the in the last moments. I mean, that certainly was felt. There was for want of better words, a disturbance in the forces. It really did register.
Well, it destroyed my New Year's Eve. I remember that. I was going, you swine, Tony, because Tony was tra-la-la-ing in, going, oh, Leigh's gone. And I know, well, he did keep it really quiet. No one knew. Well, that was an end of a massive era, that one.
But London nevertheless sort of moves on, and then there's like the era of the YBAs, and then there's that kind of, which is interesting for me because people like
we're quite resilient,
yeah,
the British, for that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean,
you know, we can beat ourselves up and then still come back and carry on. You know what I mean? What took place post Buffalo, post Leigh's death? What took over? That for me,
turn of the century moment.
Well, I got really busy doing Neneh and then Massive Attack, so I suppose I dived into the music, and then I was lucky enough to meet people like Björk, and it was a laugh working with Massive Attack because, you know, Bailey Walsh and a lot of people, you know, a lot of Neneh's videos with John Maybury, so we were all kind of joining back up again, but I wouldn't say we were being more professional, but we were delivering on a larger kind of scale. We were more, for want of a better word, kind of mainstream. We were on Top of the Pops, you know, that was it. We've got on Top of the Pops, we're not getting off now.
But you were mainstream in a good way, I think. You weren't Starbucks or anything. You were definitely bringing creativity to bigger audience.
Well, you know, that whole thing with Neneh and Massives, the people that I was working, and even with people from Björk, it was like the big time of, rather than it being fashion ideas mixing up, it was like music ideas. I mean, Neneh was like robbing her background from like her father, Don Cherry, and hip hop and punk, and you know, and Massives were definitely throwing hip hop and soul back at America. We were taking it became a bit more global, I suppose, after that. Which is a shame that Ray wasn't around, because he was, in fact, quite a global person. He used to love his trips to America and Jamaica and Japan, and he was the one I started traveling a lot.
It feels like there's a need to unpick that whole period. I mean, there are moments when it's a time for clothes, and then there's a moment when it's a time for music. But when I'm talking to people, people may not grasp that some of those changes were happening within a month or two, that you would see whole waves of music come and go in that period. I mean, things are speeding up somewhat more rapidly. You know, you went from
You know, that whole
Belgian beat would come and go of a summer, and the next thing you'd be listening to, like you say.
do a TV show. We could be doing a TV show in France, and it would be like Jazzy B and Soul to Soul would be on, Neneh would be on, and then some rapper from New York, and then it was, you know, it was the big Live Aid Nelson Mandela concerts where people from everywhere came. Music was the great communicator between the creative people at the time.
And McLaren saw that as well, I think, a bit with some of what he was thinking on.
Yeah, the way he used to steal all his stuff, you know, he was bringing all the scratching hip-hop thing to London. Vivian was mixing it. She'd gone beyond the pirate thing into kind of bow wow wow and all of that. Music was the way that you could really get. We had a bigger audience, I think.
Does it remind you of your own practice a bit though, like in Magpie, as you say, the mudlark, a bit here, a bit there, and putting it together in a new configuration?
Well, I think every scene needs someone that's shamelessly can do that. I'm just particularly good at it. Malcolm was definitely good at it, you know what I mean?
And then if you just describe, I mean, if you could just talk about, let's just say the last 5 years, what have you been doing? I mean, I saw you recently up in your studio in Kingsland Road. I heard the Chapman brothers occasionally wander in and out and record things, and you, luckily you've got your archive. You've managed to keep things in this whole period of time somehow.
I don't know how I've done that. I suppose it's because it tends to go into storage when I'm not settled or travelling, and you put it into boxes and then you forget about the boxes, and then 15 years later you open it up and you go, there's a picture of me at. So, and I'm not a big nostalgia person. I don't always like to look backwards. I'm getting better at it. But then we never stopped, basically. So we didn't have time a lot of the time when we were doing it to look backwards.
Recently, I remember you pulled out an item which had clearly come from one of his boxes, and it was a piece of metal with various safety pins and bits of add-on, creating a sort of necklace, which it looked to me like you dipped the whole thing in a tin of gloss paint or something. I mean, they're fantastic objects. When you're looking at them now, do you just go, God, what was I thinking? Or, I mean, does it, when you're looking at them?
Well, luckily, I've actually got quite a good memory. It's not just like a pile of rubbish. I do, that it can say a period of time to me, or I made that at this particular time. It doesn't mean anything to me in a funny kind of way. It means something to someone else, but then that's kind of the thing I like about it. I like the fact it means something to someone else, because I never stop, so I don't place a value on it.
That was that day, you move on.
You know, Matt, even when he comes over, and I made him come over, he came over last week, and he'll pick something up and I'll go, it's just a book full of lists of... And he thinks it's the best thing ever. Well, to me, it's just a book full of lists that I've been doing for years. I don't know, I like that about it.
One day I want him to come running into the ICO holding a VHS tape with Carry On,
Judy Blame. We found it!
Exactly. Judy, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Well, that's some of it.